I hope everyone is safe and healthy, and welcome to my presentation this year. My name is Brandon Tucker, and I'm a science teacher at Glenbrook South High School, where I have taught multilingual horticulture and biology classes for the past 7 years. Today I'd like to share some strategies I use in my classroom. Although it is geared towards a high school science class, all of these strategies could be redirected towards other grades and subjects. Further, I broke these strategies down into planning, instruction, and assessment categories. Let's start out with some strategies we can use to plan and design our course. So what I'd like you to do is search for the WIDA can-do descriptors. And what this is it's going to tell you some of the language objectives that we're shooting for with our students. And if you scroll down here, once you get to the WIDA can-do descriptors, the nice thing is this is going to be differentiated for grade level. So for instance, for me, I could click on grades 9 through 10 can-do descriptors. And not that this is the end-all be-all for our curriculum design, but it's going to give us lots of great ideas for what we can focus on. For instance, for me, I'm going to make sure I am having my students practice recounting. For instance, summarizing stories, producing information reports, sharing past experiences. I'm going to try and make sure I have my students explain, to use the why and how of ideas. I'm going to have my students argue. Now, you're going to see this in a lot of my instructional or planning ideas. I'm going to have my students argue, stating preferences or opinions and constructing arguments with evidence. That's the whole basis for a lab report conclusion, really. And then to discuss. To discuss include participating in small or large group activities and projects. So we can scroll down here, and now we can see these even differentiated into the language domains of listening, speaking, and you can have it broken down into the different levels of English language proficiency, ranging from entering to reaching. Now, I would strongly encourage everyone to review these can-do descriptors twice a year at the end of your year to kind of reflect on how things went and what happened, and when you're just starting to plan for the following year, and also at the beginning of every year when you're starting the year. So I usually review these can-do descriptors twice a year, and if you haven't yet this year, why don't we check them out once right now, and then we can review them again at the end of the year to see how things went. In all the classes I teach, I try to explicitly show my students our objectives. And further, I try and make those objectives as clear and as specific as possible. What I've then done for my language-assisted biology course I teach is I've then separated these objectives or broken them down into different language domains. Although this was challenging at first, I just started and did it, and then I tried to edit and improve them throughout the years. For instance, for our Unit 2 unit on ecology, reading, I can read a sentence about a level of ecology and match it to a correct term. For writing, number 2, I can write 2 sentences that state which biome my family's culture is from and why it is this biome. Listening, I can listen to an organism in a food chain or web and then use a picture to identify it as a producer, first-level consumer, etc. And then finally, speaking, I can state the 6 levels of organization in ecology in order from smallest to largest. Now, when we get to the assessment portion of this presentation, I'll show you how I then have reading questions on our exams, writing questions on our exams. I have incorporated listening into our exams, and I even have a speaking portion of the exam. But I think to start with objectives for a course and then to break it down into the different language domains will help show how we're explicitly trying to focus on these different language domains in our course. So now that I've created my objectives, I started creating documents called learning maps to help my students organize all the objectives from the unit into one piece of paper that also lists the connections between these objectives. Now, when I set this up on Microsoft Word, I usually set it on an 11 by 17 page so that I can fit more material on there. And And when I'm printing this, I can then fold this document in half so it becomes a folder where we can put all the other material for our unit. What then helps is that if you export this, so if you go to the Save button, you can choose the type of document and you can export it as a PDF. And that actually allows you to draw on it a little bit more easily online on Zoom or Google Hangouts or whatever online tool we're using. So I'm going to try and create this on an 11 by 17 Microsoft Word document, so it gives me more space to work. And all I'm using is I'm inserting text boxes with little ovals and little arrows here. Now, how I create these really depends on the objectives for each unit. So for instance, in our ecology unit, everything boiled down to the different levels of ecology. So on the first day of class, we learned about the differences between species, populations, communities, ecosystems, biomes, and the biosphere. And then the second day of class, we reviewed that material by filling out this learning map. So I usually fill out a learning map every day based on the previous day's info. And I started with like this kind of, ecology is made of species, or maybe you could say it starts with. And the nice thing is we can get these little connections on these arrows. And then I could then define a species right here. And I would do this over Zoom. Now in the classroom, I might be writing this on the board or using a document camera to do this, but this has been really helpful on Zoom or Google Hangouts or Google or whatever tool you're using online. And then I could write that species then help form what's called a population. And now at the end of every unit, what my students will have done is they will have created this large learning map. And if you're having trouble printing these out, just have students draw out this picture in a journal or a notebook. And my students then have all of their notes and objectives for one unit highlighted on one piece of paper. And if they have specific questions about maybe what a species is, we could always go back and look at the activities from the day in class when we learned about that. But for most of them, this one piece of paper is a nice review over everything they've done. And again, this is called a learning map. So now that I've created these objectives, one of my goals each unit is to make sure my students know about them, or at least do my best to provide them with the opportunity to know about them. So on the first day of every unit, what I do is I have the students focus on the listening aspect of this. So I just read these objectives to my students as they listen to them. And now whether you're on Google Meets or Hangouts or Zoom, you can just broadcast this in front of all your students and just read these objectives to all of them so they're listening. And I usually ask my students to not look at the screen, so I just say them out loud. Then on the second day of my unit, I have the students just read them on their own quietly. Now, I might not know that they're doing this, but again, I'm trying to do my best to provide them opportunity. On the third day of our unit, I then put the students into breakout rooms and I have them alternate speaking the objectives back and forth with a partner. Now, again, they only get half of them, but at least they're speaking through most of these objectives. And then finally, on the fourth day of our unit, and our units are usually probably 6 to 10 days every other day. So on the fourth day of our unit, I then have the students write out all of these objectives on a piece of paper. Now, I prefer for them to write them out by hand because I then have them post them, which I'll talk about in my next video. But if they type them out and have a printer available at home, that can work too. So now if my students have listened to these objectives, read these objectives, spoken these objectives, and written these objectives, I think there's a decent chance that they're going to then know what the objectives are for a given unit. Now that my students have typed out these objectives, and that's if they have a printer, or if they've handwritten them out, which is actually what I prefer, I then have them sign on the bottom of the document that I will learn these objectives. So I will learn these objectives. And then what I have them do is sign their name to it. And what I've read is that when you post or write out goals for yourself, you are more likely to achieve those goals. Secondly, if you sign your name next to these goals, you're more likely to achieve these goals. And then thirdly, if you actually post these, so then what I have them do is take this and, tape it somewhere in their room, because we're not in the classroom right now. If we're in class, I sometimes will post these in the classroom, but at home, we can just post these in the room. Now, again, we don't know that all the students are doing this, but what I'm trying to do is increase the opportunity to achieve these objectives. So I have the students write these out, write down on the bottom of the piece of paper that they will learn them, sign their name to it, and then post that somewhere in their room. So now that my students and I both know of the objectives for the units, what are some of the strategies I use in class to help the students achieve these both content and language objectives? One of the most powerful tools I've used over the last few years in my multilingual class are these 4 square sheets that I adapted from the concept of a Frere chart that I learned about when I was in grad school. So a Frere chart usually has an explanation, a picture, explanation/definition, a picture, and then some practice down below. And I adjusted this when I was thinking about a piece of paper that could hold the 4 language domains for a class, incorporating in the content for a day. So I'll usually use one of these 4 square sheets a day. And what I provide on it is an opportunity for my students to explicitly practice the content objectives of the day, incorporated into the different language domains. So I've read through usually a chapter or pages in a textbook, our textbook, and I've tried to broken that down into a paragraph or 2. I try and adjust this to maybe the average reading level for my class. Now, for some, this is still very challenging, and for others, it's maybe a bit too easy, but I try and just adjust it to the average reading level for my class. So for instance, when we were learning about the microscope in our cells unit earlier in the year, I had a short paragraph that our students would read. Now, this works great online because many of my students don't have printers at home, so I'm able to share this document, and I can enlarge it on the screen. And then I usually read the first sentence. I start by having all of my students read it on their own. And I give them a minute or 2 for this. Again, I am not certain that they are all doing that, but I'm giving them opportunity to. After we've read it individually, I then read the first sentence, and I take student volunteers to continue reading just one sentence. Now, many of these words are challenging, but I think it's good that we're challenging these students, or all students. When we finish the reading section, we then go to the listening section. So in this section, I usually give notes to the students, and it might be to label a picture. It might be to write down a process in order, but I talk them through it. So for instance, with this diagram of a microscope, I might not label all 14 structures there, but I might just tell my students, okay, object number 12 is called the coarse adjustment knob. So try and find number 12 and try and write out coarse adjustment knob. Now, after my students have tried to write out that word coarse and adjustment, which are both difficult, I then on the screen am able to annotate this through Zoom. Now, you could also just spell this out by talking them through it, or you could give them a annotated key later. So I talk my students through, and they have to focus on listening, but I make sure they listen first before I type and they read. When we're done with that, I then move them onto a speaking component of the lesson. So for this section, I usually have a short intro, and then I send my students into breakout rooms where they need to talk about a concept for 1 or 2 minutes. I'm not able to visit all my breakout rooms always, but I try to jump in and out of rooms for 10 to 15 seconds to hear how their discussions are going. We then come back as a large class and we discuss this. In this little speaking area, oftentimes I'm not providing any notes, but we're just talking and listening, but a good chance to practice speaking. And then finally, I have my students write about some of our objectives based on this concept. So for instance, if I wanted my students to know about the process of using a microscope, which was kind of mentioned earlier, I might then give them this little these close paragraphs that go over the steps of using a microscope, and I give them a little word bank possibly. And then after they try to write it out, then I might go through an answer key again. Now, by the end of the year, I would say my writing sections move away from fill in the blank to write 4 sentences comparing and contrasting eukaryotic and prokaryotic cells. And then I provide space for them to write their response. So again, the best thing about these sheets, I feel, is that I can present my content for the day. The students have nice guided, organized notes to fill out. And they've also practiced all 4 language domains. So every day, my students will have practiced the reading, listening, speaking, and writing of biology. Now, many teachers have been using funds of knowledge forever. But 15 years ago, Moll, Amonte, and Gonzalez published a book with the same name that really got into how teachers can incorporate students' knowledge into the classroom. And the premise of funds of knowledge is that students and families bring knowledge to the classroom, and we can validate that knowledge to foster a culturally relevant classroom. Telling the students that it's not always us feeding them information, but they bring value to the class as well. Now, online, we can just make some of our activities incorporate the knowledge they bring in the classroom. You could do this on Zoom or Google Hangouts just by asking the students to share what they know about any concept. You can then incorporate it into your activities as well. So when our class this year was learning about human immunity, in the writing section of our notes, I had them write about a home remedy their family uses and who taught them this. And we then shared these with the class. When we were doing a project earlier in the year in an ecology unit, rather than just learn about biomes, I had the students teach us about their home country and culture and incorporate that into the biomes project, which we then presented online. So every student in our class learned about the different biomes relevant to the cultures that all the students came from. And then even on a little homework assignment, I had the students write about the animals that were in nature in their home country or culture. And we maybe learned about some new animals that lived in different areas of the world. And then we also translated those into our first language in the activity. You could have all your students send a chat in online, asking them about something that their family does in a different situation. So again, maybe not always possible, but try and see if you can incorporate funds of knowledge into a unit, and then maybe into a lesson, and then into a single activity. Now, words can be broken down into 3 tiers. Tier 1 words are the most common words students would use, and these would be ones that students might even use in class or in social settings. The most basic words, maybe the 500 most common words. Now, tier 3 words are the subject-specific words that students would maybe only be using in their biology course, or in their music course, or in their social studies course. And the tier 2 words now are the ones in between. These are the academic words that students would use across different subjects. Down below, I have one list that I searched for and put together. The words sector, percent, evidence, identified, theory, benefit, policy, variables. These words could be used in many different courses, and these are oftentimes the words that we forget to explicitly teach students how to use. Now, online, we could be putting one of these in the chat every day, or just using one of these in our discussion with our students, and then trying to sneak these words into your notes and discussions and activities, and try and actually explicitly teach a few of these words every day. Now, I found another list that shows the tier 2 words based on grade level. You can just search for these online, and I think it helps to print one of these out so you can kind of check them off and know that you're going through them. Don't worry about finishing one of these lists in a given year. Just try and incorporate more academic words, tier 2 words, into our daily classroom routine. So in a free write activity, students are going to write as much as possible without regard for spelling or grammar. You can scaffold a free write for time or structure. Now, the rules of a free write are to never stop writing. Now, online, You can have students typing on Google Docs and you can see their progress as they type. So it's a great tool to look at and a great activity you can still do online. And if students run out of ideas, you just copy down the last word or sentence. Now, I mentioned scaffolding this activity. At the beginning of the year, you could give your students a 1-minute free write, where you could give each student a Google Doc possibly to write online, or type online, or you could have them writing on a piece of paper in class, which I often do. And maybe the students are just typing out words we learned today. So we're going to write, we learned about cell, we learned about eukaryotic, we learned about prokaryotic, we learned about nucleus. Oops, you shouldn't go back. So maybe students are just typing out words they learned today without regard for spelling or grammar yet. Maybe in the middle of the year, you give students a 2-minute free write and they're going to start writing out sentences explaining what they learned today. And then maybe at the end of the year, students are going to have to write for 5 minutes straight. They're going to be having to write paragraphs, and maybe you give them the task that they must incorporate the tier 2 words that we've learned. So a great little activity, maybe if you have some extra time at the end of class, a great little activity, and then you can also scaffold it throughout the year to expand on our expectations. So a close is when students are putting words or phrases into blanks in a text. Now think about some of your writing expectations for a given year, and think about how we could use a close from the beginning of the year to the end of the year to kind of scaffold a student's understanding towards meeting these expectations. For instance, I teach a high school biology class, and at the end of the year, I would like my students to be able to write a simple 3-sentence conclusion. At the beginning of the year, I tell my students we're going to write a claim, evidence, reasoning. I tell them what a claim is supposed to be, and then I provide them a stem with blanks, and underneath the blanks, I even tell them what's going to go in that blank. In the middle of the year, I'm then going to tell them claim, evidence, reasoning. I'm going to take away the directions for what goes in that, but I'm also going to give them a little stem to kind of get them started. Now also, these lines are pretty short right now just because I'm trying to fit it on this page, but I would give them more room to type out this text on a normal document. And then at the end of the year, I would just simply put the words claim, evidence, reasoning, and have the expectation that my students should be able to write these 3 sentences and remember what goes in them. So think about what some of your writing expectations might be at the end of the year and how we could scaffold these using a close. So in the classroom, I would bet many people have tried a jigsaw activity where each student becomes an expert in one small topic and then shares this with a larger group, maybe by going to different stations in the room. Well, online, what you can do is you could have each student in a group watch a different YouTube video that you provide a link for. You could organize this into a table kind of like this, and then the students can be put into breakout rooms when they're done and then share out their knowledge. So what I did in a DNA technology activity was had each student watch one video and write 2 short paragraphs about the video. They then were put into breakout rooms so that each breakout room had a student who's watched a different video. My students then had to speak those 2 paragraphs out while the other members of the group listened. So in essence, in this activity, all of my students had a chance to read, write, listen, and speak about different DNA technologies. And despite us having the limitations of working online through e-learning, we were still able to do a jigsaw by putting students in different breakout rooms and by having them watch different YouTube videos. There's the music. So many of us might recognize this music as the music from Kahoot, which is an online free application we can use to create online quizzes and games. And one thing I would encourage us to incorporate into this maybe is a listening component. So if we play a Kahoot, we could, instead of giving written directions so the students are reading, what if we just speak them out instead and tell the students to listen to the questions? So for instance, in my ecology unit, this is the level of ecology that includes a group of species. So we're isolating the listening component of language now rather than the reading. And maybe to make this a little bit more accessible, we can also add some visuals in while still listening though. This is the type of way to represent data in science. This is one way to represent data in science. So instead of having reading in the Kahoot, how about we try adding a listening component where the students are listening to directions rather than reading the questions. And this is also a great activity we can still do online. Most of my students are playing the Kahoot on their phone while I'm sharing my screen of the directions. So what if we could incorporate the different language domains more into our homework? For instance, when we were learning about mitosis and the cell cycle in our cells unit, I had students draw and label the cell cycle below, and then they needed to use that diagram to describe what happens to the cell cycle to someone at home or online or over the phone in English. Now, when I was in school, I would have the person sign and date this, but what I'm doing now is just having my students write down the name of the individual and have them date it. And then again, trying to incorporate some of those funds of knowledge and have students strengthen their first language, I then had them do the same thing again, but had them describe what happens during the cell cycle in their first language. So now I'm trying to incorporate the speaking domain into homework activities. So what if instead of adding the speaking component to the homework, what if we could isolate the language domain for our homework? So what if I had my directions as an audio file and the students had to listen to those directions to then answer the questions? So what I did here was created the audio file. In pea plants, the tall allele, big T, is dominant to the short or recessive allele, little t. For question 1, I would like you to write out the genotypes for a heterozygous. So we could provide the directions and then have the answer spaces below. So again, this time my homework, although it was helping teach kids or review Punnett squares and genetics with them, it kind of isolated the listening domain, so they would have to listen for their homework. So now you're not going to find me doing this every night. Who has time to do this a few times a week? But I'm going to be doing this a few times this year. And the more often I do it, I feel the faster I get at it, where I can now make one of these homework assignments in 5 or 10 minutes. So to add this audio recording, start out by recording yourself using an audio recording program. I found that the easiest for me is QuickTime. Save that to your desktop. You can then go to Google Drive, hopefully if you're using the Google platform, and you can upload this file to Google Drive. You can then create or just copy over your normal homework assignment, deleting the written instructions. And then you're going to attach a link to that Google Doc. You're going to attach a link of your file to this Google Doc. And now our homework becomes a listening homework. So let's say in class today we learned about the microscope. And you know that on most days I'm going to have my notes set up like this, where we read, listen, speak, and write about a objective. So maybe some days, either in class or for homework, I'm going to give my students a translation opportunity. Again, trying to incorporate their first language into our course. So maybe towards the beginning of the year, I just have them, after they read that text, try and translate some of the words from there. Again, trying to sneak in some of those tier 2 words like focus, adjust, in addition to our tier 3 words like microscope. And then also putting in some tier 1 words just like eye and small. And then maybe later in the year, I ask my students to translate this entire passage. So giving students a chance to strengthen their first language while they also reinforce the content that we learn in a day. Now, during my cells unit, I might normally send my students back to work in groups at a lab bench, and I might put sticky notes out on the table with all of these words on the sticky notes. And then I would have my students organize these into 3 different groups. Is this an organelle you find in an animal cell, a plant cell, or in both? Well, now that I have the limitation of not being able to send students back into lab groups, something like a Jamboard can help you have this experience or include this experience in your classroom still. So Jamboard, I taught myself how to use Jamboard in about 5 minutes by watching a YouTube on it. And what it is it's a slide that students can access. They can create a text box if you give them editing access through sharing feature. So you can go and share it with all your students, and you can change the access to all the students in your school, and then you can make them editors as well. And then your students can maybe add their own sticky note and like, oh, what about a Golgi apparatus as well? So we can add that maybe. Maybe you make them add their own sticky notes. And then the students can drag these words around and sort these words into categories possibly, although none of these would be correct. Now, how do you do this with smaller groups? Well, all you need to do is create one Jamboard slide. You can go up here and you click on these 3 boxes, and you can now duplicate the slide as many times as you want. So what I do is send my students into 6 to 12 breakout rooms, so they're only working with 1 or 2 partners. And then I say, who's ever in breakout room number 1, I want you to go to slide number 1. That's the slide you're going to work on. And then students in breakout room 5 will go to slide 5 and work on that slide. So in this sense, we can still have students working in groups, organizing little post-it notes, and still do a word sort in class. Now, something similar I used to like to do in the classroom was to provide pictures on the table and have students talk about these pictures and try and organize them into groups. And again, difficult to do online, but Jamboard is a useful tool that you can use for this. So instead of adding sticky notes with terms, you can, on the left here, add an image, and you can insert some images you find. And then you can have students try and organize these images into different groups or patterns. And then again, you can even have them try and search for an image of their own, download it to their computer, and then upload that image if you've given them editing access to this document. So rather than do a word sort online, you can send students into breakout rooms and have them do a picture sort. So a GIST is another acronym for a reading strategy we can use in a multilingual classroom. It stands for Generative Interaction, Schemata, and Text. Every time I present about this reading strategy, I have to look up what it stands for because I think of it as getting the gist of something. What is the big idea? In this reading activity, which we can still do online just by reading to students where they don't even have the text in front of them, you're going to read a paragraph or a series of paragraphs to your students and stop after each paragraph and have them write down a summary sentence for it. And you could even read each paragraph twice. Now, if you give them a Google Doc to fill out, you could then track their progress as they type out these responses. And if your students all don't have access to that, they could just be writing this down on a piece of paper in front of them. For instance, I might read a paragraph about biotic factors. A biotic factor is any living part of the environment. Biotic factors include animals, plants, mushrooms, and bacteria. For example, the insects that a bullfrog might eat are biotic factors. Another biotic factor relating to the bullfrog is the heron that might eat the bullfrog. Species that compete with the bullfrog for food or space are also biotic factors. Now, class, please summarize what is a biotic factor into one summary sentence. And then your students would write that summary below, and then you could read another paragraph for abiotic factors and have them write another summary sentence. And maybe as the year progresses, you have students writing more and more summary sentences based on longer texts. And this is just another way to change up a lesson or a day. So instead of reading, it's more about listening. And you can also have students, if they all have a book at home or a common book, read along as they listen to you. So this day is really focusing on the listening and then writing domains. So to try to get my students to work in groups using a close, but to require each student to contribute, forcing them to contribute, I'm going to send out 3 words with definitions to half my class. For instance, maybe the words prohibited, neutral, and ineffective. Notice that these are also those tier 2 words that I showed you we're trying to focus on. And then I send an email to the second half of my class with definitions for the words convert, conflict, and ban. Now, in class, I would be giving my students an envelope with these words inside. But since we're not in class, I'm just sending half my class an email for the group A words, and then half my class an email with the definitions for the group B words. I then send my kids into breakout rooms, making sure one student in the group has the A words and one student in the group has the B words. Students then need to talk and converse. They need to listen and speak. As they read through this text, for instance, about the War of 1812 or the lead up to the War of 1812, and the students need to now work together to put their words in, knowing that they only have 3 out of the 6 words that are missing. Now you can help them out by providing which students' words will go under the blanks possibly. So for instance, in the early 1800s, the United States was a neutral trading nation, but became a part of a conflict between France and Great Britain. So now while we're learning about the War of 1812, the content for the day, we're also incorporating the tier 2 words in the lesson, and we're also working with reading, speaking, listening, and writing. So we're getting all the language domains with these tier 2 words incorporated into our content for the day. Now, if you were to walk into my biology classroom on your first day of class, you would find a sign like this hanging outside our room. And what it does is it provides the word welcome in as many languages as I could find. Another fun activity is for my students to come and correct some of these throughout the years. And then we also add to them if there's anyone missing. So in addition to this, if you're then to walk further into the room, you're going to notice hanging above our board are little miniature flags representing every country my students have ever come from. And then to give you an idea, where do you buy miniature flags from? Miniatureflags.com, of course. I think they're about $3 or $4 each. And, throughout the years, I got about 20 or 30 of them now hanging in our room. So to provide students with a little self of home in this classroom. Now, how do we do this online? Well, I just like to sometimes for some of our activities, find pictures of their flags and post them on the activities. And then every now and in our chat, you can welcome the kids with some of these in the chat, whether if you're using Zoom or your Google platform. So again, trying to incorporate some of the students' home culture into our classroom. So every time we read a text, what we're really doing is reading a story. Further, in my science classes, I would say every time we watch a lab, we've been watching a lot of labs online, and I've been having students doing some simple labs on their own at home. So also, when you're doing a lab, what you're really doing is acting out that story. So I then like to have my students practice their writing skills by reenacting these stories and writing about them. So in our class, we do a lot of story reenactment in the setting of a lab or an experiment. Now, at the beginning of the year, I might give students some directions where they're just filling in a few keywords, following the format first, second, next, then, and finally. Now, although this procedure could be 20 steps, why not kind of simplify and summarize it down into 5? Then in the middle of the year, I might just provide the words first, second, next, then, and finally, and my students have to finish that sentence. And then towards the end of the year, I'm just telling my students, please write a procedure. And I don't even have to mention the word 5-sentence. They just know that they're going to be writing a 5-sentence procedure, reenacting that lab we watched or performed online. Now you could do something similar with a book or movie. Maybe at the beginning of the year, you're watching a movie or you're listening to your teacher read a book online, or you're watching a YouTube with a class. And maybe at the beginning of the year, your student only fills in a few words reenacting the story. Maybe only 3 sentences even. And then maybe towards the middle of the year, you're providing some of these stems, but they're doing 10 sentences. And then maybe at the end of the year, you can take away these scaffolds, and the students can just write their summary about that book or movie, in 5 or 10 summary sentences. So a great chance for students to practice summarizing and writing as they are reenacting that story, that book, that text, or that experiment that they've watched. So I started by creating my objectives, breaking them down into language domains. I then made sure my students knew about these objectives, even having them written out and hanging on their wall with a little signed pledge that they know what these are. Now we then went through a variety of instructional strategies to help my students learn these objectives, these can-do descriptors. So how am I going to now assess all these objectives? So I think the first thing we want to do is make sure that on our assessments, we have these objectives on there. Maybe the objectives are the assessment. Oftentimes in my class, those objectives are the questions on the assessment. For example, on the Unit 2 exam in my biology class, students will read sentences about a level of ecology that describe it and then match it to the correct term. They will then read sentences about biomes and use a table that has rain and temperature values to choose the correct biome. That would be like a multiple choice question. They will then read a paragraph about a food chain or web and draw a picture. Now online, the nice thing is I am using Mastery Manager, which has a drawing feature to it. Or you could also use an annotation feature on the Google platform like Kami for students to do drawings on the test. I then make students write a sample lab report on the exam. There will be a question that says, please write 2 sentences that state which biome your family's culture is from and why it is that biome. Students will then read an energy pyramid and write a prediction about what will happen at a different level. I then add listening questions to my exam, which I'll show you in a minute. And I even have kids add speaking components to their exam, which I'll also talk about in a few minutes. Now, most traditional tests have quite a bit of reading on them. So you're going to really be demonstrating your understanding of reading in biology. And some tests even have writing questions on them. But what about listening and speaking? What I've done is provided students to demonstrate their mastery of the listening of biology and speaking of biology on my tests. For each biology test we've taken this year, I have recorded myself providing the directions or the question on QuickTime, which I showed you about earlier, and then I have embedded this or uploaded it onto our test-taking platform, which many have a chance to upload an audio file. If you do not have that, you could also just create a part of your assessment that is on a Google Doc, kind of like that homework I showed you earlier. This way, we are assessing the student's ability to listen about biology or listen about your content. For example, on the Unit 2 exam in my biology class, students will read sentences about a level of ecology that describe it and then match it to the correct term. They will then read sentences about biomes and use a table that has rain and temperature values to choose the correct biome. That would be like a multiple choice question. They will then read a paragraph about a food chain or web and draw a picture. Now online, the nice thing is I am using Mastery Manager, which has a drawing feature to it. Or you could also use an annotation feature on the Google platform like Kami for students to do drawings on the test. I then make students write a sample lab report on the exam. There will be a question that says, please write 2 sentences that state which biome your family's culture is from and why it is that biome. Students will then read an energy pyramid and write a prediction about what will happen at a different level. I then add listening questions to my exam, which I'll show you in a minute. And I even have kids add speaking components to their exam, which I'll also talk about in a few minutes. To wrap up today, I'd like to discuss the power of true-false questions on exams. True-false questions can really get rid of some of the noise and distraction of all those answer choices. The students will still need to read carefully, really focusing on that reading domain. The other great thing is that you can incorporate some of those tier 2 words into the question because there's fewer worry about all these choices. And when people worry about students just having or just being able to guess their way through true-false questions, I'd like to remind you that the chance of a student guessing correctly on 10 true-false questions is greater than 1 in 1,000. So we can really eliminate some of the distraction and noise and focus on that reading domain in our content classroom.